Hi, everyone. I'm Annie Rogers, and on behalf of the ADDitude team, I am delighted to welcome you to today's ADHD Experts presentation titled Don't Tell Me What to Do, Pathological Demand Avoidance in Neurodivergent Kids. Leading today's presentation is Diane Gould. Diane is a licensed clinical social worker and the founder and executive director of PDA North America. She co-authored with Ruth Fiedler the book Navigating PDA in America, which was published in June 2024. In April 2024, Diane was diagnosed as autistic. She has a private practice in the Chicago area where she serves neurodivergent children, adults, and their families. For the last 40 plus years, she has worked for both private agencies and school systems. And we're here today to discuss pathological demand avoidance, or PDA. Children, teens, and young adults with PDA exhibit a strong desire for autonomy and are extremely sensitive to real or perceived demands. They may refuse to do a homework assignment just because you reminded them that it's due tomorrow, or rack up an impressive string of tardies because you set firm expectations for when they should leave the house. PDA differs from other diagnostic categories, and it's important for parents, teachers, and other professionals to understand the challenges and supports to help children with PDA and their families. Today's discussion will cover behavioral strategies and support for children with PDA, including how to help them build self-regulation skills and manage stress and strong emotions, as well as what not to do as the parent of a child with PDA. We'd like to begin today's webinar by asking this poll question to our live audience. In what realm is your child, teen, or young adult's demand avoidance most impactful to you and or your family? Please select the options that most resonate with you and tell us more in the comments box under the video player, if you like. For answers to common webinar questions about slides, transcripts, and certificates of attendance, click on the FAQ tab of your webinar screen. And I want to mention that the winter issue of ADDitude magazine delves more broadly into ADHD and the turbulence of puberty specifically, as well as the power of music to regulate the ADHD brain and much more. Our upcoming spring issue will contain a collection of articles about autism, including the latest research, the emotional cost of masking, and how to navigate burnout. If you're not yet a subscriber, visit ADDitudemag.com/subscribe or click the Subscribe Now tab on your screen. Webinar participants will get 15% off their order. Okay, without any further ado, I'm so pleased to welcome Diane Gould. Diane, thank you so much for joining us today and for leading this really important conversation.
Oh, I'm so delighted to be here and grateful to have the opportunity to talk about PDA, which is kind of my favorite topic. And when I'm trying to learn something new, I like to kind of start with the history. So hopefully that's the same for some of you. So how PDA really got started was there was a psychologist in the UK, Elizabeth Newson, who focused on doing assessments on children, and mostly it was diagnosed kids as autistic or PDD at that point, pervasive developmental delay. And she noticed this subgroup of children who were different than the majority of kids, but very much like each other. And one of the traits that stood out to her was that these kids just couldn't help avoiding everyday tasks. So she named this group Pathological Demand Avoidant Kids, or PDA, and she intentionally chose the word pathological because she wanted people to understand that these children just couldn't help it. They weren't trying to be difficult. They weren't doing this on purpose. Now we kind of wish she hadn't chosen the word pathological, but she did for a good reason. So it took kind of years, even in the UK, for awareness to build. at their kind of autism society in the UK. It took till 2008 before it was named. The first book on PDA came out in 2011 by Phil Christie and Ruth Fidler. And the PDA Society was formed in 2014, and they're kind of the world leader. And we started in 2020. So we're not so behind. We're behind, but not so behind. So I started PDA North America because a parent, a mom, wouldn't take no for an answer and kept sending me articles about PDA. And I think everything in the world of disability or neurodivergence happened because there was a mom who wouldn't take no for an answer. And I got really interested in PDA and thought, all right, I'm going to get training from somebody in the UK and put together a conference. So March 2020 was our first conference. If that date rings a bell, it's because that's when the pandemic started. So the week before the pandemic, we had 165 parents come from all over America. I brought 2 speakers from the UK to present. And we got people back on the last flights that were leaving Chicago. It became apparent at the end of that conference that this was a beginning, not an ending. I hadn't really thought past doing the conference. And PDA North America was established. We became a nonprofit in 2023. So we're growing quickly, but we're still tiny. We do webinars almost every Thursday night. We are planning our 7th conference, and hopefully some of you will be able to attend. It's hybrid. We do trainings for parents and professionals, and we've just launched a PDA in education connection-based learning program for schools that hopefully some of you will be able to tell your schools about. We have a whole learning lab of webinars and insights, which are kind of our blogs on our website. We have a community connection list so people can find each other. And probably what's used the most on our website is we have a PDA affirming professionals list so people can look for therapists and other professionals for their kids. And as was said in my introduction, I wrote a book on PDA a little bit ago. So you all might want to look at that book if you want more information. You know, as our real focus of PDA North America over the last years has been awareness, just awareness of PDA. And now, because that's worked, we need to mention that not all demand avoidance is PDA. Kids and teenagers and adults avoid demands for all kinds of reasons besides PDA. Even neurodivergent people, even autistic people, executive functioning gets in the way, anxiety gets in the way. There's so many reasons people avoid demands. So not all demand avoidance is PDA. So I wanted to point that out. And people generally want numbers, and we don't really know. The only study I know of that really looked at numbers was 10 years ago in the UK. And they found that 1 in 4 autistic people fits the PDA profile. It's just a guess. And I don't think it's correct, because one of the things we have found out in working and focusing on PDA is that PDA individuals are so often undiagnosed or misdiagnosed. Adults and teens are often misdiagnosed as bipolar or having borderline personality disorder. Children are misdiagnosed ODD, which is oppositional defiant disorder or conduct disorder. And what we're really finding out is that Black and brown children are so much more likely to be diagnosed as having a behavior problem, ODD, conduct disorder, instead of having their neurodivergence explored at all. When I first started this kind of PDA effort in 2019, 2020, I was pretty blown away that I heard the same stories from parents who contacted me. And it didn't matter if it was a parent of a 5-year-old on a farm in Iowa or a parent of a 15-year-old in an apartment in Manhattan. And parents talked about the light bulb moment that they had when they heard about PDA. And I'm hoping some of you watching today might have that light bulb moment. Parents talked about that their child had received many diagnoses, but the parent thought they never really fit. And some parents had thought their child was autistic based on their own research, but would take their child to a neuropsychological evaluation and would be told, oh, no, he's way too talkative to be autistic, or she's so social, she can't be autistic, or they make eye contact, so they're not autistic. And probably the hardest thing for parents to talk about was how hard they tried to follow all the advice that they were given from therapists, psychiatrists, pediatricians, teachers, and even in the parenting books. And those strategies didn't work and often made things worse. And hearing those stories really motivated me that we needed to do something. So I had mentioned that we're not so thrilled with the word pathological, even though some people do like it based on the same original reason it was called pathological, that it's not under someone's control. But adults, mostly in the UK, started renaming it pervasive drive for autonomy, or some people even persistent drive for autonomy. And they did that not only to get rid of the word pathological, but to highlight that the more important thing to focus on is this drive for autonomy, and demand avoidance is part of having this drive for autonomy. So that's something that most people now prefer that term in America. But we kept the initials PDA, but they're not great initials either. So we're struggling with that. So when I first approached Ruth Fiddler to write a book with me, I had a whole notebook of questions about PDA because she had written many books about PDA and knew how to write books, but she was a real expert. And before I had even my first question out of my mouth, she interrupted me, but in a very polite British way, of course, and said, Diane, we can't possibly talk about PDA until we talk about autism. And then went on to say that the US is so behind in our thinking of autism, and we still talk about it in a very outdated, stereotypical way. She didn't mention ADHD in that conversation, but that's the same, and that the understanding has evolved, and I'll talk about that later too. So I was so grateful, even though I was a bit taken back by this conversation and thought, oh, now I have to learn everything new about autism. But it's been so helpful professionally and personally to me. And now I'm happy that there's multiple voices in America talking about the need to understand autism differently than how I was taught. Dr. Devin Price is one of those people who's written a couple books, Unmasking Autism and Unmasking for Life. And what I like that he says, and he's an autistic adult, is that autistic people tend to be hyper reactive to even small stimuli in the environment and have trouble distinguishing between information and sensory data that should be ignored versus data that should be carefully considered. And I think that is so important in understanding autism. He also talks about that processing a situation takes more time and energy than it does a neurotypical person. And again, I think that is so important to understand. And any of us who are neurodivergent or supporting someone who is knows how exhausting it can be to be neurodivergent and process information and operate in a world that's not designed for your neurotype. Also, one of the people whose work I admire is Donna Henderson. And I love her definition of autism too, because I think it's like so pure and simple, but right on. And she just talks about being autistic at its core means having a different kind of neurotype. And people who have this kind of nervous system experience, process, and respond to the world differently than non-autistics. That it's all about the nervous system. And that is what we have found in Understand PDA, is that it's about recognizing nervous system differences and neurotypes. And her books are amazing if people are looking for resources. And I think I have found that whenever there's a TV or movie character who's autistic, that character portrays the stereotypical presentation. And, you know, it's kind of the presentation that a lot of medical professionals still hold on to, and what many of us were trained in. It's that person loves routine and is concrete and pragmatic. You notice their sensory differences and their social differences, but you don't really notice their empathy. It's a very externalized presentation with high anxiety, and under stress, they go into fight, flight, or freeze. But the majority of autistic people, including PDA individuals, people who have ADHD and autism, have this like non-stereotypical, much more nuanced presentation with high camouflaging and masking. And the special interests can blend in socially and culturally. People who fit this majority profile are hyper empathetic, and it can be very internalized. So what you see on the outside might not be their inner experience. People also share high anxiety, but under threat, they might use fight, flight, fawn, or freeze. So we have to kind of move away from this traditional approach of autism. It's a way of experiencing the world. It's not a checklist of behaviors. In Illinois, where I am, to qualify a student under autism for special ed, everyone at the table has to agree to this checklist of stereotypical behavior. It's really triggering. And I feel like the PDA folks in the UK, they were so ahead of everyone, in that they were always broad and nuanced and inclusive. And they, from the start, said there's no gender difference in autism. There's also a psychologist I admire in Belgium, Peter Vermeulen. And one of the things he talks about in his books is that autistic people have prediction differences in the brain. So if you're less able to predict what it will feel like or be like if you say yes to a request, you're less likely to acquiesce. You're more likely to refuse. And I think that has implications for PDA. We're happy that the neurodiversity movement seems to be making some ground, but we have a far, far way to go. Just looking at that there's not one way of thinking, learning, and behaving. There's differences are not deficits. And there's so many ways to interact with the world. I know that the relationship between ADHD and autism is so complex. And what we do know is that at least 50 to 70% of autistic people also have ADHD. But what we think, even though we don't have the data, is that it's higher for PDAers and that symptoms may overlap or camouflage each other. And it's all really skewed because until 2013, a provider couldn't diagnose both ADHD and autism in a person. So we don't have the full understanding that we need to really support people. This Venn diagram was influenced by the work of Megan Anna Neff, who does all kinds of fabulous Venn diagrams. And more, we're seeing the overlap between ADHD and autism as the understanding for both evolves. Like when I was taught about ADHD, no one ever mentioned sensory differences. No one talked about rejection sensitivity for either diagnoses. There's a lot of overlap, and we all have so much to learn. And one of the areas I think we've really fallen short in is understanding co-occurring conditions. We know that autistic people, and it seems like PDAers even more, have so many co-occurring conditions. But often in the diagnostic process, once someone is diagnosed with autism and ADHD and maybe PDA, often people kind of stop being curious and exploring. But we know from the people we serve, there's so much more. There can be learning differences, autoimmune differences, GI disorders, and chronic fatigue. We know lots of PDAers who are struggling with PANS and PANDAS and POTS and MCAS and Ehlers-Danlos. And these co-occurring conditions impact daily life and quality of life. And we need to really dig deeper and explore. So I'm going to talk a couple minutes just the features of the PDA profile. And what's important to understand is that PDAers generally have better social understanding and communication skills than other autistic people. And they kind of use that to their advantage. And it can mask difficulties they're having in communication and social situations. So it can be really a hidden disability. So many PDAers don't get the support they need because of that. So we know kind of by definition, right, that PDAers avoid everyday demands, but PDAers use social strategies to avoid. So it could be distraction, giving excuses, instead of just saying no. So it might take a while for people to realize that they are having a pattern of demand avoidance. PDAers are so social and crave social interaction, but they still have problems in social understanding and relationships. PDAers can have very fast mood changes, and that can cause those misdiagnoses. PDAers can be impulsive, and there's so many reasons for these kind of behaviors: sensitivity, intensity of emotions, and just being hypervigilant. One thing that's striking about PDAers is they often act very differently in different settings. And probably the most common is that a PDAer might fall apart as soon as they get home from school. And when the parents report this to the school may say something like, "What? Like, she's an angel at school. He's so compliant, and we don't see any of this." And then might say to the parent, "Oh, wow, is something going on at home? Is there a lot of stress? Are you disciplining consistently?" And of course, that drives, distance and a problem in the relationship between home and school. But it is very common for PDA children to hold it together and mask and camouflage in certain environments, and then when they get home, fall apart. Also, PDAers, like other neurodivergent people, but sometimes even more extremely, have kind of a fluctuating capacity is a good way to look at it. So they might be able to do a specific task or handle a specific situation one day, but not the next. And this can be confusing, again, especially at school, when people say, "Well, I don't know, he could handle the assembly last month. Why is he refusing to go today?" Or, "She did fine on the math quiz yesterday. Why is she falling apart?" Or saying she has a stomach ache and can't take the math quiz now. Capacity fluctuates. Stress is cumulative. PDAers, we know, have difficulty complying with the requests of others and are unable to follow the rules and routines set by others. But what's also really important to understand is sometimes PDAers can't make themselves do things they want to do. It can be a child looking forward to a birthday party or a vacation for a long time, but when the day comes, they just can't do it. We talk about PDAers having a need for control, and I have found in my practice that taking control decreases anxiety probably faster than anything else, and I think that's part of it. Something else that's unique about PDAers and PDA children, even very young children, is they don't really appreciate hierarchy or age difference. A little kid might think, why would the principal deserve more respect than a second grader? Respect should be earned. It shouldn't just be based on title. And this, of course, can cause problems when there's adults who feel they should be treated with respect just because they are adults. PDAers can be very comfortable in role play and pretend, and can use that to avoid demands, but also to comply with demands. Like other autistic people, PDAers can be very obsessive, but they're usually obsessed on people, not on objects. It's not so much a problem if your PDAer is obsessed with Taylor Swift. It's more of a problem if your PDAer is obsessed with the girl who sits next to her in her reading group. And because of that, she might not want that girl to play with any other kids at recess, only her. So in play, which is stressful anyhow, a PDA child might be very demanding and controlling and dominate the situation. But PDAers in the right situation are often really engaging and charismatic. So that's something to think about. PDAers, like many autistic people, don't really get credit for being empathetic and emotional, but PDAers are so sensitive that they're like sponges. They absorb the emotions around them. So they might get dysregulated if a classmate is dysregulated, or if an adult is frustrated or angry at them. Even if they're pretending that they're not, they're going to feel angry and frustrated. And I think one of the reasons it's not always understood is that when a PDAer is struggling to be okay and so anxious, it's just too much of a luxury to worry about like the impact of their behavior on someone else. They're just trying to survive and be okay. And PDAers are known for big meltdowns, and they can be hard and they can be aggressive, but we like to think about them more as panic attacks, because in a panic attack, people are approached with empathy, sensitivity, offers of help. But when we view meltdowns as a challenging behavior, they're greeted as with threats of consequences, reminders of expectations, and generally frustration. And we need to remember that during one of these panic attacks, the child won't be able to problem solve or process your language or information you're offering. I'm going to talk just for a second about demands, because we all know, what demands are when they're like, do your homework or wash your hands. But I hadn't realized that fun things like, hey, let's go get ice cream after dinner, let's watch a movie, can also be demands, but they are for PDAers. I also didn't realize that expectations are demands. And returning a greeting, just saying good morning to your child or to a student in your school, has the expectation that they're going to return the greeting. And that is a big demand and can dysregulate them. And then self-imposed demands. So it can be doing things they want to do, or even their body's demand to go to the bathroom, to eat, to drink can be a demand, or doing things you want to. You finally get a toy you've been waiting for or a book and not being able to read it. Sometimes just being able to talk is something a PDA can't make themselves do. Hopefully some of you have heard about the polyvagal theory, which I am not going to do justice. I'm going to talk about it for a minute. But it's Stephen Porges's theory, and he talks about behavioral responses always representing how a person's nervous system is regulating the body's response to threat. And survival instincts fall under a few categories, right? So there's engagement, connection, there's defense, fight or flight, and then there's life threat, which is freeze. And he talks about all of us have this thing called neuroception, which is a subconscious surveillance of safety and threat in the environment. It's like an internal smoke alarm that goes off when there's threat. But for PDAers, their neuroception is so sensitive and reactive, it can sense threat when no one else can see that threat. And for me, fight, flight, and freeze is what's underneath all the challenging behaviors I see in people. The other thing sometimes we lose sight of is that humans are wired for connection. That's what's going to prevent us from going into fight, flight, or freeze, and it's going to get us out of fight, flight, or freeze. And sometimes we make the mistake of isolating people when they really need us. So PDAers have many shared traits with autistic people, which is why mostly PDA is tied with autism. Most of the books, including mine, talk about PDA as an autistic profile. But more and more, other people are speaking up and saying, yeah, my child's ADHD, and we believe they're PDA. And other people were saying, I think PDA maybe could be a standalone diagnosis. And the real truth is we don't know. There has not been enough research, and our hope is that in the future there will be. But we know how we can support PDAers regardless of kind of what box we're putting them in. And PDAers do share traits with autistic individuals, differences in the social arena, sensory differences, interoception, that reading your internal cues, including emotions, high anxiety, and emotional regulation. But many people, and maybe some people you know, are told they're not autistic because PDAers have frequent eye contact. They're more fluid in their social skills. They love spontaneity and novelty and not routines, especially routines that aren't their idea. Rewards, including praise, can trigger them. They can be very imaginative and unorthodox, and they express empathy, and that leads people to be confused. So I'm going to talk about support because that is so important. And it took me years, sorry to admit, to understand that supporting a PDA is a mindset, not a strategy. I early on heard an adult PDA say he hated the word strategy. And I thought, oh, I use the word strategy. And sometimes I still slip up with that. But strategies can be kind of rolled out and taken back, usually based on what's convenient for us. But to support a PDA, it's really a change in mindset. It has to be focused on a genuine relationship. Those are the most important things. It has to be overriding. We need to choose priorities. We need to allow recovery time. We have to listen to understand because it's all about understanding. And sometimes PDAers respond to humor and that spontaneity, but we have to be flexible. We need to help PDAers plan their own routines and schedules because they might need that structure. And for us to learn how to use language indirectly, including thinking aloud or declarative language. But it's all about trust. And I think of things as sharing tasks as equal partners when you're wanting something or something's needing to be done by a PDAer. Be equals, share the task as partners, which is different than just helping a person. Empathy helps, but it has to be genuine. It's so important to realize that stress is cumulative, and that's why we have that fluctuating capacity, because people's window of tolerance changes all the time. So we're not looking for antecedents or triggers. We know that behavioral approaches do not work for these kids. And we also need to learn that our emotions are contagious. I think masking is so complex, and we need to partner with PDAers and everyone on being their most authentic self in the safest way. And it's not always safe to be your authentic self. So we need to understand that. Most neurodivergent people can only do tasks that make sense. And everything has to be worth the energy and stress. It's such an important concept. We need to work on helping people understand their inner life, including feelings, and how to advocate for themselves. But first, you have to understand your feelings and what you need. But we know pressure and being pushed doesn't work. Things we use to motivate kids feels like pressure and pushing. But at the same time, PDAers need so much from us. So not ignoring their needs, not letting them just be. There's probably some Ross Green fans watching. And my favorite thing he says is that challenging behavior is only a sign or a signal that it's a problem. It's not the problem. We know that PDAers can go from 0 to 60 in a heartbeat. And that's for the reason that many are at 50 or 55 as their baseline, and they don't know anything else. And PDAers work hard to meet our needs and please us, and that's why sometimes they negotiate or try to offer other alternatives. I used to think kids were being difficult when they do that, but they're trying to meet our needs. And again, everything has to be worth the energy and stress. We say at PDA North America, the juice has to be worth the squeeze. We ask a lot of PDAers. We ask a lot of neurodivergent kids, and everything takes a toll. And sometimes we can't make things better, but we can avoid making things worse. So here's my nagging slide. Resist the urge to give consequences or threaten them. You don't have to worry about holding them accountable. Adults lecture and talk too much. And in part of that, we dismiss their reality. We try to convince them otherwise. We remind rules and expectations, and that's never what's getting in the way. We express disappointment, and I do not believe we need to process after the fact what happened, whether it's a mistake, a misbehavior, a meltdown. We can just move on. We have many opportunities where we can use the information we've learned proactively. Otherwise, usually feels like shaming. We can just let things go, and we don't have to get stuck on we're letting a kid get away with bad behavior. We can think of behavior as an iceberg. And some of you may have seen this before. When we talk about behavior and when we write behavior plans, we are just focusing on that tip of the iceberg, that little tiny observable part. But where we need to support are all the things happening under the iceberg: sensory differences, learning disabilities, social differences, anxiety, and even the history of school disciplinary practices. When we address these underlying issues, the behavior takes care of itself. And many people find PDA because their child's in burnout. And I had not expected that. So we need to work to prevent burnout from individuals. And there's things we can do. And so much of what we need to do is about managing our own nervous systems so we can co-regulate with our PDAers, that they need that connection. They need a calm nervous system to regulate their nervous system. So that's what we need to do. Is, even though self-care is a luxury, we need to do it. And we're going to make mistakes. So we need to just be honest that we're going to make mistakes, because it's part of being human, and we're not going to always be able to regulate our nervous systems. PDA North America, as I mentioned, is a growing nonprofit. We have all kinds of resources, and we hope you spend some time on our website. No one has ever turned down because of financial limitations for any of our pre-recorded webinars and trainings, or even our virtual conference. And I am just so happy that you all are here. All right, so Q&A.
Yes, Diane, thank you so much for that presentation. I have a notebook full of notes, and I know that the listeners here today really appreciated your time and expertise. Before we launch into the questions, I wanted to circle back briefly on the poll question that we asked at the outset of today's conversation. And we asked people in what realms of life did they feel the impact of PDA in their children sort of most starkly. And we found that executive functions was the top of the list. So that can be everything from time management to prioritization to working memory, you name it. Household expectations, so chores, things of that nature. Number 3, homework and studying, a daily headache. Family relationships, understandably, and tied in with that also was parental stress and mental health. So I will do my best to touch on some of those during this Q&A.
Sure.
Absolutely. So I wanted to actually start out with a little bit of kind of brass tacks. A number of people wondering if you can help them differentiate between oppositional defiant disorder and PDA. And just understanding the differences and why it might matter to understand the differences.
Yeah, it's a hard one. I mean, in a perfect world, I'm going to choose my words wisely. In a perfect world, ODD wouldn't exist in my mind because it's not helpful. And it just kind of describes what we're seeing. It doesn't give any useful information. But I've come to realize and change my opinion that we can't make it disappear because it's the only thing available to so many humans, especially people who live in marginalized communities and members of the Black and Brown populations, the global majority. Um, so ODD is not neurodivergence, and it is different in that most people consider ODD behaviors as intentionally pushing back against authority, where PDAers don't even think authority is a thing. They're so it's not that. PDAers can't make themselves do things they really want to do. And that is so different than ODDers. PDAers work so hard to please adults, and they talk about that all the time, but they're unable to make themselves do things. So they're different. I think one of the important things is when someone is diagnosed as ODD, to not stop there and to dig deeper and look to see if there's neurodivergence. It may be autism, it may be ADHD, it might be learning disabilities. But I feel like there's generally other things going on too. And not everyone has access to the resources to get a diagnosis of, a neurodivergence or a learning disability. Unfortunately, that is not available to everyone.
That was a very illuminating distinction. Thank you for that. And kind of along those lines, just another point of clarity, that though PDA is more common among autistic children and teenagers, it's not exclusive.
Correct. Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And we don't really know research wise. And because of autism, the understanding changing so rapidly, all these things are hard to say, and we don't have research to say. One thing I want to make sure I mention is, in my opinion, using the PDA approach won't hurt anyone, so because it's really about being attuned and responsive. And even if you're not sure your child is PDA, especially if what you've been trying isn't working, there's no harm in kind of looking at this PDA approach and trying it.
I will say a number of people, your slides of advice to parents, much of that advice is almost the opposite of what we've heard
I know. And I've added a new one just last week saying attunement and responsiveness is so much more important than consistency. And when I was young parent, I'm still a parent, but when my kids were young, and when I was a private practice social worker and a school social worker, I talk to parents all the time about the importance of consistency. And now I don't believe in that at all. I think being responsive and attuned to where your child is in the moment is so much more important. And it kind of is how we treat each other when we're being kind. Like if I like usually make dinner and I've had a horrible day and I would say to my husband, "Oh my God, I can't make dinner tonight." If he'd say, "Well, it's your job. Like, I'm going to be consistent. Like, you always do." Like, that's not going to make me feel good. Where if he's like, "Oh, yeah, today, right, today is the day you can't make dinner. I get that. Here, just sit still. I'm gonna have a cup of tea. I'm gonna make dinner." Like, doesn't that feel better? Doesn't that make the relationship better? I just don't know why we can't treat kids that way. It's what I find works. And I've always kind of had that impression in kids. I just kind of let all my training get in the way, I think. Um, and, and I know, and we talked about this, and before, people are really judged when they parent differently. They're judged by mothers-in-laws, siblings, neighbors, teachers, doctors, therapists, like, "Oh, you're too indulgent, you're too permissive, your child's never going to learn." Consequences are how people learn. And there's so much judgment out there. And that's why I think for parents, and this kind of was mentioned on the poll, parents of a PDA need to find community with other families who have similar kids who are parenting the same way, because it gets lonely and it's hard to fight all that judgment. And we kind of internalize all those judgments because we're human, and it leads us to make mistakes.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. One of the sticky areas that people are asking about is this idea of the accountability, and how to navigate this. Well, for parents and educators, that
Yep.
Our kids are going to be faced with accountability needs in their adult lives. How do we walk that tightrope? Do we let them fail and take responsibility for their actions? It's so tricky. Do you have advice for that piece of the puzzle specifically?
Yeah, it's so tricky. And the reality is it all depends too, like on the context and your child and their age and the situation too. And I think sometimes we blend accountability with like consequence too. I mean, I think it's different when your child like hurts a sibling's feelings or breaks their toy, or um, talking about how they can repair that relationship. Like, it might be doing a drawing or baking cookies for the sibling, versus losing their tablet because they were mean to the sibling. It's there's different ways to look at accountability, and we do just have such a consequence basis, not like a growth basis too. And I think it comes of the understanding of what went wrong, what actually happened, to what was going on, and can we prevent it next time? Because the adults do need to add proactive support often too. And I think neurodivergent kids often need more support or different support or more interdependence than independence sometimes too. And I think sometimes if we're too focused on accountability, it can be really scary for kids who are struggling. And it can make them feel very misunderstood if we are giving the impression that we think they were in control of their behavior or they could have prevented what happened.
Mm-hmm.
But these are big, important, hard questions. Absolutely.
So hard. We have one educator here who I think encapsulated this well. And she wrote, are there any expectations that classrooms and schools can realistically hold a student with PDA accountable for if your typical expectations, such as doing a teacher assigned task or taking notes or listening to the teacher, is something that causes them anxiety and may, trigger an outburst? A lot of educators wondering that they want to be helpful and they are struggling for how to approach and walk this tightrope of expectations and realistically being attuned, but also having 32 other students in the classroom.
Right. And that's why we just launched our PDA and education course, because it is so complicated. I was just talking to a school today about what if there's a fire drill, we need to expect the student to be able to leave. And I'm like, of course. However, things are more complex. If every expectation feels at that level to the student, then that kind of emergency situation is just one more expectation and requirement. Those need to kind of stand out. Also, when everything is relationship based and you understand a student's need and you have trust, like in that situation, you're going to be able to put your arm around that kid and say, oh, I know these things are so loud and stressful. I'm going to walk with you out. Let's talk about that video game that you love so much. They're going to meet that student's needs and help them meet that expectation. I think with work, it's going to vary. I think some days the student might be able to do a task in the classroom, and other days they might need a break outside of the classroom to go to some other supportive adult, or they might be able to need to do an alternative that they might quietly draw because that might not be at time. So I think it's that flexibility. But once you build that trust and the student knows if they can't handle something, they can opt out, and it doesn't have to escalate to be a big deal and nobody's going to force it, things can calm down. There's a lot that can be done to support PDA students, but generally it's not just little tweaks, it's a paradigm shift.
It's a paradigm.
So short answer to a big, big question.
It's a huge question. And I will mention once more that Diane has provided a wealth of links and information back to the PDANorthAmerica.org, her website. There is so much to explore there. I encourage everyone to do that. And as a final question, I will just ask, do you offer support groups or resources specifically for parents of children with who are twice exceptional, who have PDA and also are gifted and talented? This seems like such a tricky dynamic.
It is, and we're doing a webinar on it this spring, and we have all different kinds of support groups, and we have they're peer-led, they're free, and we have many twice exceptional kids as part of our community, and it is tricky. These are tricky kids. These are very tricky kids, and it need everyone who is educating, treating, parenting a PDA needs a village and a lot of support. The kids need a lot of support, and so do families and professionals. And spend some time on our website because we want to be there for you all.
Well, Diane, thank you for kicking off the support. This was such an incredibly insightful and helpful webinar. We so appreciate your expertise and your contributions to our community.
Oh, I'm so grateful for the opportunity. Thank you so much.
And thank you to everyone who joined us today. A lot of people asking if they can get a replay and the copy of the slides. Yes, we will follow up in a few hours after the live event. And if you want to access the event resources later, you can always visit ADDitudemag.com and search for podcast 590. If you're listening in replay mode, you can just click on the episode description. And please know that our full library of ADDitude webinars is available as a podcast. It is called the ADHD Experts Podcast, and it's available on most streaming platforms. This free live webinar is our last of 2025, and we hope that you will join us in the new year. Our first webinar on January 7th is titled How to Accomplish Your 2026 Goals One Day at a Time. And then we will follow that up with a related webinar, New Year, New Systems, Home Organization Help to Clear ADHD Clutter and Shame on the 13th. So to make sure you don't miss any future ADDitude webinars, you can sign up to receive our free email newsletter at ADDitudemag.com/newsletters. We hope everyone has a lovely holiday season, and we hope to see you in the new year. Thanks.